You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Jeff.
Oh boy, what I do now?
Am I going to take us off the rails today? But I've been thinking about...
Don't get us canceled, please.
No. Well, you have full edit capability here.
This is true.
I've been thinking about one of the most fundamental concepts of identity and access management, or digital identity, whatever you want to call it. And it's the word trust. And what does the word trust mean? I'm going to get back to that. But I also was thinking about, I think it's the opposite of trust when it comes to identity, which is anonymity. And anonymity on the internet is more than just a minor thing. I mean, I think it's kind of like a fundamental concept. And you see what's going on with Twitter, right? And to me, Twitter exemplified not only, not solely responsible, but kind of the cesspool of the internet, if you will, right? And I'm not talking about
Twitter.
We're on Twitter. Check out our Twitter handle, by the way.
Speaking of cesspools, at IDAC podcast. How's that for a commercial?
And I think it's the fact, anonymity that drives a lot of it. I mean, I think at Twitter, like, you have a lot of people who will be very bold in their own name. But a lot of us, like, you can't be too bold in your private, in your communications that are in the public, assigned to your true identity, because you can wind up getting yourself fired. And I would say that makes up a large percentage of society. So people wind up creating these anonymous handles and going on whatever, website has a comment section, or on Twitter or something like that. And they post these things. Now, my question to you, I'm going to give one more example before I turn it over to you. But my question to you is going to be, is anonymity a good thing or a bad thing? Should it be eliminated? Should there just be one Jeff Stedman? Or should you also be able to create a Jeff Stedman anonymous account? So, Joe Stedman. And here's why I ask. So we all know that you ran a Chili's, right? And I was reading an article recently where it was about Olive Garden, and someone posted the question, is the unlimited breadsticks truly unlimited? Is there some point where you order too many breadsticks and they say no? And a person got on there and said, I work at Olive Garden, and if you were, I forget what the number was, honestly, because it was like so outrageous. Like, who the heck would order 12 baskets of breadsticks? Something like that. Like, that's the cutoff point. And they're probably not allowed to say that, right? That might be a fireable offense. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But I'm getting to the point that in that sense, anonymity would be good, that you could go out there and, like, share that information and not have to worry about it, like, having a blowback on you.
Well, I think it's a good thing, and for the most part, it's like anything else. There is downsides to anything, and first of all, the world is not ready for two Jeff Stedmans. It can barely handle one. So let's just get that clear right now. I get is being anonymous on the internet good? Holistically, probably. I try to see the positive where I can. I think of things like what's happening with governments, maybe that have, less than ideal free speech rules, right? Being anonymous there is probably helpful, not only to get the word out, but maybe even for your own personal safety and security. When it comes to voicing dissent, not every country has the same, free speech that we do in the US. Does free speech come without repercussions, though? No, I think there are always an action that can result from any other action. So some people are brave enough to attach their name to it. Some people aren't, for any reason. It could be safety, security, or maybe they just they are putting on a public persona versus what they think privately. So I don't know how to answer the question, other than You were talking about trust and the opposite of trust being anonymous. I immediately went to deceit as the opposite of trust, and thinking it from a negative standpoint is okay. Well, if I trust so and so, and we're an identity show, so let's talk authentication, right? If you're doing an authentication, you're essentially trying to establish a trust between people. If you're trying to break that authentication, then you're trying to deceive the system, which probably means you are not the person that is the intended recipient of whatever that trust session is about. So I don't know if they answered your question or not. That was a very existential of you, but
It's very existential overall, but I kind of feel like the authentication is kind of the middle of the chain because the authentication is proving you are the identity. But if you set up the identity in deceit, then you're authenticating a deceptive identity.
yep.
And I also thought about this trust component in terms of it's actually in two directions. It's the user trusting the organization that they're, a part of, or they have an identity in, and then it's the organization trusting the user that this is a real identity and the real person is assigned to this identity. And I guess that's where things like verifiable credentials come into play. So to me, when I was starting to think about that, it's like, well, I don't want to go through verifiable credentials I don't want to tie my Twitter account or my Cura account to my driver's license because I might want to say something that, you know, I don't I don't want my employer to be like, "Hey, you can't say something like that. You can't have that public opinion." So that was kind of my thought. And then I thought, in terms of trust, because this comment came up, I think maybe on our previous episode where we talked about, the organizations becoming the identity provider, and would people trust that organization? You think about governments, or you think about big tech or corporations, like who trusts those entities? Do people trust the United States government or some state government to be actually a credential or an identity that they actually trust?
Well, the answer is probably every answer in between, right? And I don't even think that it is a binary decision. I think it's anywhere from 0 to 100%, maybe even negative number from a trust perspective. Is you definitely do not trust, right? These types of entities or whatever it might be. So I think it's
Zero
all over the
trust.
place. Yeah, zero trust, negative trust, positive trust, whatever the right terminology would be. But I don't, only what is it? Only a Sith deals in black and white. So I think there are tons of shades of gray in between. And I think when we start talking about sort of verifiable credentials and this idea of really kind of like a self-sovereign identity where I can only share the parts of my identity that are relevant to the decision that needs to be made, whether it's an authentication decision or authorization decision. It's kind of like the example I've used in the past of, well, I know it to get into this bar, I need to be 21 to prove that I am of age to drink. I show them my license, and the bouncer or whoever is checking ID validates that I have the correct birth date to coincide with establishing that I am 21 years old or older. At the same time, they're also saying my home address, my height, my weight, eye color, a whole bunch of stuff that isn't relevant to that decision. And I think this is sort of where the direction of the industry is heading when we start talking about managing your own data from an identity perspective. Is all you really needed to tell the person was, all they really care about is, are you 21 or older? If the answer is yes, everything else is irrelevant. The answer is no, still, all the answers, all the other things are relevant, right? So I think what we're talking about really here is sort of managing, to some degree, those credentials, whether it's verified or not. We're starting to get into layers of trusts. Sure, you can go and establish a fake identity. It is identity theft. We have a lot of reliance on, okay, well, if I went and gotten a driver's license and I was able to fake that, that means now I can fake something else and then fake something else. And you sort of like build this, house of lies or a house of cards that might collapse, right? If one of those identities gets gets found out or whatever it may be. So I don't know
So
where I was going with that, but
no,
that's what I was thinking.
that's great dialogue, and I know we're not going to solve this here, but for anyone
Sure.
listening, I don't think so. But anyone listening, you know, comment on when Joe, hey Joe, when Jeff puts out the LinkedIn post that the episode is out, go out there and put a comment. I'd love to hear people's feedback or their thoughts on trust and identity.
Yeah, be curious. I think plus it'll be good fodder for another episode where we kind of talk through like here's what we heard from people in the industry and kind of what their thoughts were. Um, so I think I know where you were going when you started talking about verified credentials. I think what we wanted to cover today was Microsoft Entra. Is that right?
Absolutely.
All right. So Microsoft Entra came out. Well, I guess it was announced a few months ago. Um, I thought this is an episode that is a long time coming. Is to sort of explain what it is, what it's about, and hopefully demystify some of it. We're not going to solve all the answers and all the questions and all that stuff today, but at least hopefully give people kind of an overview of kind of what it is and give people some information around that. And there's probably no better person that we could bring on, and his name is Eric Woodruff. He's a product technical specialist at Semperis. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thanks, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. And we've had Gil from Semperis back on, I think it was September of last year, 2021, episode number 110. We're recording episode 191, so it's been a little while since we had someone on from Semperis. And we're going to talk about Microsoft Entra. You're going to kind of hopefully help clear it up in my mind as to what it is and maybe more importantly, what it's not. But we've got tradition around here. When someone joins us for the first time, I like to find out what their identity origin story is. How did you get into identity? Is it something that you chose or did it choose you?
That's a good question. And I feel like my career is almost two parts. For the first half. So actually, when I started my IT career, I was a Unix engineer back in the late 90s during the dot-com boom. And then fast forward a bit as that whole bubble sort of collapsed. I started working with Active Directory for a bit at Time Warner, and then I spent a good majority of my career at the New York State courts. And working there, I would say I was a generalist, working within the Windows sort of server ecosystem. But when I started there, it was a big eDirectory group-wide shop. And by the time I left, about 15 years later, it was Azure Active Directory, well, going to the cloud and whatnot. And I think just looking over the years at the transformation there, I definitely had identity choose me. And I guess I'd say that because as Active Directory became more and more important, we moved away from eDirectory and whatnot. Like someone sort of had to, take reins there. And securing identity, when I was there, I never thought of myself as a security person, right? I thought of myself as like an infrastructure generalist, whatnot. But then I actually left the state and spent a bit of time working at Microsoft. And when I started there, I'd say that's what the sort of chapter 2 of my career, started. And there, I would say I chose identity. So I was a premier field engineer, and we were given sort of the luxury to pick out of like the Azure suite of things as to what you wanted to focus on. And just as I started to dig into like MFA and conditional access and other identity technologies, I really enjoyed it. And so since then, I've worked in a few other identity roles, and definitely, though, I find identity interesting. And honestly, I think I would say that only then is it when I would consider that I became an identity practitioner strong enough to like call myself one.
And now you're with Semperis. I guess for those who aren't familiar with what Semperis does, what's the 30 seconds, maybe 60-second long elevator ride pitch so people can kind of be aware of what it is that you guys do?
Yep. So at Semperis, we have a few different products, mostly revolving around hybrid identity, which the episode that Gil was on, you guys spoke about that. But right, so talking about Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, but primarily focused on Active Directory. There's one product we have that's an ITDR platform, and it's really, securing Active Directory and also extending that out now to the hybrid identity in Azure AD. And the other piece of software we have, which I actually wish I could go back to places I used to work, and I know this sounds salesy, but we never did disaster recovery testing of Active Directory at a lot of places, because it's a huge pain. And I started here in August, and actually seeing our other product do Active Directory restores. It's ADFR. It's a pretty cool piece of tech. So
I feel like disaster recovery of AD is where it's at, man. If you consider yourself a Microsoft shop, you better be doing it, because a ransomware attack's goal in life would be to own your Active Directory. If they own your Active Directory, you are in big trouble if you truly are a Microsoft shop.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I thought it's interesting in listening to some other podcasts about, ransomware attacks. It always goes back to, right, like, regardless of how the threat actor initially got in, it's when they owned Active Directory that everything just completely fell apart. So
that's true. Yeah, I've seen it in my own professional experience. So, but we did not bring you on to talk about disaster recovery. We're trying to learn about this Microsoft Entra, and we'd love it if you would, kind of educate us on it. I know Entra is really like an umbrella for multiple tools, but whatever you know about it, that would be great to kind of share with us and the listeners.
yeah. So I would say Entra, depending on what angle you look at it, it may be marketing. But there's also the sort of suite of technologies under it, right? So, the piece of Entra that most folks are familiar with, or probably most familiar, I should say, is Azure Active Directory. And then, so there's a history about a couple of years ago, Microsoft took all their security stuff and they renamed everything to like Defender for X, like Defender for Cloud. Their CASB solution became Defender for Cloud Apps, et cetera. And then they did a similar thing in the spring of 2020, where all their compliance and data governance became Microsoft Purview. And then it was this June that they, announced Entra. And when you saw the announcement, it was really taking Azure Active Directory and also now bundling in Cloud Knox as Entra Permissions Management. So that's their KIM or KEEM, CIEM solution there. And then also Entra Verified ID, which when it was in public preview was Azure Active Directory verifiable credentials. So
Azure AD has been around for a long time. So is it just that Azure AD is now bundled under Entra, or there's some new features that make it? Because as an old school Active Directory person, it's like you've got the Active Directory users and computers, which is not a end user facing administration tool, but those of us who used it over the years grew to love it and hate it. But it gives you ultimate flexibility. But I kind of felt like Azure has a lot of similarities in terms of its admin focus rather than kind of an end user focus. So I guess let me put my question like this: is Entra Azure AD meant to, replace having something like SailPoint or an IGA or an ITSM tool for managing access?
So given the classic consulting answer there is it depends, right? So, there are components that existed even before Entra for identity governance and sort of, the end user aspect of things with like a My Access portal for entitlement requests. What I think is interesting is within, it's probably been the past 2 or 3 weeks, noticing that when they added new features to Azure Active Directory Identity Governance, it also is now being renamed to Entra Identity Governance. it's not like out there. If you go look at like the Entra sort of suite, but if you go look at the docs, it still refers to as Azure Active Directory Identity Governance. But I'd say to your question, I mean, I think they're definitely making a push, as far as like identity governance goes, right? And they've certainly come a long way, at least in the past few years, especially. But I'd say the primary focus just seems targeted at least with getting rid of MIM, FIM, ILM for those customers.
Well, that's so to me, that's ultimately the most important thing to most folks who are in our industry with regards to Azure AD is, all right, in the on-prem world, I had those products you just talked about, and what's my equal in the Azure world. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, for those who don't know what MIM, FIM, ILM are, kind of that, approach that Microsoft took, and then, what are the analogous platforms or tools in the Azure world?
Yeah, I mean, so MIM, which was FIM, and then ILM, right, was sort of their sync engine tool. And there's also a web interface that most may find a bit clunky. That's right, connected to SharePoint. You need like a PhD to operate MIM. I'm proud that I've never actually dealt with MIM, and will admit that I'm not super deep with it. But MIM was a lot of like we're bringing in user information from an HCM. It was self-service password reset. It also had some PAM components to it, and some of that is a bit scattered through Azure Active Directory. And I'd say there's certainly some people out there who are like, well, where is the cloud version of MIM, right? But if you look at Azure Active Directory, self-service password reset has been out there for quite a long while, right? I think a lot of the functionality of MIM, though, with the user lifecycle workflows and entitlement management and all that sort of stuff, is what's primarily getting pushed into Entra identity governance.
So I kind of feel like when you think about identity governance, the key is answering the question of who has access to what. And it's really like two parts. It's the provisioning side of, in other words, defining who should have access. That would be your workflows and everything, where you assign access to people and then provision it to some endpoint like Active Directory or some application. But then there's the actual, what do people actually have, right? So we're pushing all this out to an endpoint. Now we're pulling it back. Some funny business may have happened behind the scenes, right? That we should be able to now pick up and say, hey, how do all these accounts have these extra privileges? Or who created these accounts? Because we don't recognize the account QA test 1, 2, 3. To me, what MIM always was able to do is only that first part, give you a web-based tool to manage giving access to people or taking it away, and then provisioning it. So, and I kind of always thought of MIM doing that via some kind of like directory synchronization. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I would say now with Entra, that, I mean, they have access reviews out there, right? So you can have your certifications or attestations or however you want to put it. Whether it's maybe as robust as SailPoint, I suppose I won't. I don't know SailPoint enough to sort of make a strong comment there. But it definitely is primarily targeted still at like the I'd say the Microsoft ecosystem.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I think, to me, this is kind of my perspective, right? Is that there's no way it could be caught up with SailPoint. SailPoint's been doing this for over a decade, right? And so you can't just catch up overnight like that. But so that's the first tower that we've been talking about, is this identity management, if we use the old school term. The second tower was Keem, or as we've been schooled on recently when we had Paul on the show last week, Kim, and that's the old CloudKnox tool, right? So Microsoft acquired that product. When you're using CloudKnox, do you feel like you're in Azure? Is it like the same user interface and things like that?
No. So with CloudKnox, the first round of integration, I mean, there's definitely done some work on the back end, but when you go to the Entra portal and you click on CloudKnox, it opens like a new tab that is basically what feels like CloudKnox was. So,
okay, like a totally separate application. They basically,
yeah.
but that in some ways is a good thing because to bring over all that functionality and try to fit it into the existing framework, that'd be a major ordeal in itself. Talk to us a little bit about what CloudKnox does, so that users who aren't familiar with that would have some baseline understanding.
Yeah, so I mean, right, that's your cloud infrastructure entitlement management, and to the Kim versus Keem thing. I feel like it's similar. Where I always thought it used to be Seam, and then at some point I was told it's now Sim, and that's so we don't confuse it with Siam, and it goes on and on. But to your question, I mean, yeah, right. So I think of in the Azure world, but it's not just Azure specific, that identity would tend to focus on things that are, I guess, closer to its heart, right? And you'd see a lot of organizations who may have a bunch of subscriptions, or if it's AWS accounts or whatnot out there, right? And they kind of delegate off the administration of who has access to what out there. And to me, I mean, I think there's more like I guess I'd say the philosophical piece of does control over access to that belong under like the identity umbrella, which I feel like your Kim solutions are kind of bringing it back here. But it's also to help govern that, right? To make sure that it's the who has access to what. There's the just in time piece for, at the right time. And also there's, what I'd say is similar to like access reviews out there, right? Making sure that, you don't have privileges just hanging around. Makes you think of old file servers or something, right? Where you'd go look and everyone has permissions to everything and nobody can ever make what's what or what. So,
yeah. So, okay. So the first piece was Azure, second, or Azure AD. Second piece was CloudKnox. The third piece is verified credentials, right? And
yep.
What's the company line on that product? I mean, what is that all about?
So, I mean, I would say verified ID is the area I have had the least focus. I mean, to me, having worked more with customers, I guess, out in the field, especially when it's more in the like delivery consulting role, you tend to be more focused on like the issues at hand, where in my opinion, verified credentials and decentralized identity and all that feels more like future, when you've got people who you still have issues with basic things like phishing resistant MFA, but it is their decentralized ID sort of product out there, and when it was announced and even under public preview, right? Microsoft has been, I think, interestingly good at, running sort of hackathons to try to get people like thinking about, like what can we do with this, right? But I also know that there's some folks who sort of look at it as like a solution where the problem hasn't really been defined yet. So
yeah, it seems to me that Microsoft is making investments in identity, whether it's going out and purchasing kind of leading edge products or developing products themselves in house based on Azure AD or like the verified ID piece which you just described. I'm wondering, you go to a lot of the Microsoft partner conferences, right? Talk to us a little bit about where they're heading with these products, at least what information is being shared with the public.
yeah, I mean, so I think if you look at cloud, right, there's a lot of times where it's that AWS may trump Microsoft relative to IaaS or PaaS. Uh, I strongly feel like Microsoft is trying to position themselves from, I mean, not just an identity, but also a security aspect as being like, they're like, we're your go-to for multi-cloud.
One-stop shop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a recurring theme. We've had a lot of folks on the podcast recently talking about this idea of converged identity, which is really taking the components which were these pillars of identity management and offering at some level all of them. So maybe you grew up as an access management vendor, but now you're offering lifecycle and privileged access management, or maybe you started out privileged access management and now you're dipping your toe into these other areas. It definitely feels like Microsoft wants to be that one-stop shop.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and honestly, I think to sort of try to pull that off, you need to be one of the big sort of players out there, whether it's, I mean, there's the big three, right? And they seem to be positioning themselves, I guess I'd say relative to being like that one-stop shop. So
Who do you point to as the big three?
the others be Google and AWS.
Okay. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, in terms of providing cloud services to enterprises.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess when I say that, I mean big three and big enough that, right? I know on one of the episodes, I think you talked about how Okta sort of tried their hand at IGA, right? And this is no knock on Okta or anything, but just I think Microsoft has the sheer weight of their services, also with Office 365. I mean, you talk to a lot of customers who they want like that Azure AD thing. They're a 365 shop, and you're like, you already have it, right? So just the way it kind of is sort of out there, whether you know it or not, sometimes, and that weight of the company.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast with Satya Nadella. Actually, I had listened to it yesterday. It's called the Tools and Weapons Podcast for anyone who's interested. But he was making the case about, you've got to continue to innovate, you've got to continue to disrupt, or someone's going to eat your lunch. And so while Microsoft is the 800-pound gorilla, that doesn't mean someone couldn't sneak in. You mentioned Okta. They didn't try their hands in lifecycle management. They are actively trying their hands in lifecycle management. They're building their platform. And so, look, Microsoft has been around for like 40 years or something. It's like some mind-boggling number. People have preconceptions of Microsoft. I think they've what do you call it? Reinvented themselves, I guess, if you will, with Nadella as the CEO. I think he really shook things up. But I think that, he's right. If they're not going to continue to innovate and disrupt, even their core products, people start to question, hey, can I do this better, cheaper? Things that companies used to get money for, now you can get for free.
Yep.
Right. So do they fall in love with making money on certain things so much that they don't adapt to the market where maybe something's becoming free? So, last question for you on this topic is just around, I meet with a lot of CISOs and program managers, security folks who say, we're a Microsoft shop, right? So they're buying the E3, E5 licenses to manage everything. They have usually very few applications that fall outside of the Microsoft ecosystem. They might be using Microsoft CRM, Microsoft Dynamics for ERP. They're like all in. Of course, they probably have some best of breed cloud solutions, but these are shops where they are doing things Microsoft way. My question for you is, from an IAM perspective, Do these folks also need IM tools beyond what's available with Entra?
I guess I'd say it's back to the classic. It depends, right? I've seen some things, some interesting, IM tools for like healthcare, also for K-12. But you see it go both ways. I've had customers that have, stuck with Azure Active Directory for K-12, and they're federating Google Workspace back to it, and all their students are using it. But you also see some interesting, I'd say, technologies developed out there for more of those. I don't know if I'd say they're fringe cases, right? There's tons of healthcare out there, but I can't think of the name. There's a company that sort of is specialized in, authentication for, healthcare providers, like, your on the floor nurses, doctors, stuff like that. So yeah, I think it may or may not sort of satisfy your needs, and ultimately, right, each organization needs to, I think, take a good look at, how they operate, what they have, and also, put aside maybe their fan, personness, just whether they like or dislike Microsoft, or I guess I wouldn't be fan personness, but hatred of. But I feel like that's a classic consulting answer where I didn't actually really answer anything. So
It depends, right?
Yeah.
Well, you bring up I think this is kind of one of the undertones that as I'm listening here is preconceived notions, right, around capabilities and products and vendors. And some people are pro Microsoft, some people are not pro Microsoft, right, or Apple or Google or AWS. Every product has its fans and its detractors. And I think what we sometimes get stuck into is we use the product 15 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, and it is not the same product. Things move forward. I don't think anybody is really in the business of putting out bad products, or at least they hope that they aren't. And they're always trying to improve. The challenge is does your business objective or your technical objective align with what the capabilities of the products? If we talked about, Microsoft 20 years ago, or Okta or Ping or SailPoint for that example, right? Any of these kind of bigger identity vendors that are out there, their products were not as capable 20 years ago. They have all gotten better. They're not perfect, and they're still not the answer for everybody. There are still use cases that they're just not good at. I think one of the chief knocks, for example, on Microsoft is that it's great when you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, and then it starts to fall apart pretty quickly once you leave the Microsoft ecosystem. And so people look for alternatives around that, and they sort of like, they get this bad taste in their mouth where it's like, oh, that thing sucked. We hated it, right? And I'll never use it again. And in the meantime, they're probably doing themselves a disservice because it could be the right fit. I see a lot of companies who, they have Office 365 and they're, using Microsoft, but they just like don't want to use Azure for single sign-on or for MFA. And it would be so much easier if they did. There's other technical issues where they just can't or won't do it, or, whatever it might be. But I always find it interesting when I run into those clients who are very heavy into Microsoft, for example, and they use something completely different that is totally in the sweet spot of what they should be using Microsoft for.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something that you see.
No, I see, I've seen the spectrum. I think you're hitting on an interesting point in that definitely as technology's evolved, it's more difficult these days to have technology drive business decisions than business drive technology. But I think a lot of us tech folks still want it where technology is driving business. But no, I've done workshops where, like, the second you say hello, they're like, I hate Microsoft, especially when you worked for them. It's a difficult conversation to try to be like, well, I hope you don't personally hate me, right? I'm just here to try to help.
Nice going, Eric.
You spend a ton of money on Office 365, right? And you have Azure AD. Like, let's see what we can do with what you've got. So,
and we're talking about Microsoft. I hear the same thing about Oracle, and we would never wish Oracle identity management on anybody. Okay, well, you know what? all things being said, it's still a pretty good product, especially if you use it where it's supposed to be used. It's like anything else, right? If you have one product and you try to make it do more than what it's designed to do, of course it's going to struggle. It's not designed for that, right? It's like having the the label on the shampoo bottle: "Do not drink this." It's there because somebody tried to drink it at some point, right? There should be like a nutrition label or warning on IT products. Hey, just because you've got MIM doesn't mean that it should be your entire identity and access management platform, right? Something like that. We've been talking kind of a lot here about Entra. I guess if you had to sum up, what people need to think about when it comes to Entra, like what's like the main takeaway that somebody should come off with that?
I think it's really focusing on the sort of components of it, right? So to me in particular, I guess I'd say it's the Azure Active Directory piece of it. And if you, in particular, are a O365 or M365 customer, right? Looking at how, you may own a lot of stuff. One of the things I would audit Azure Active Directory environments a lot. And what you would come across again and again and again are customers who they have no idea what they own, right? And some, they may have something else deployed that they want to get rid of. Some it's just they don't even know it's out there, and it is a lot of stuff, right? It's like trying to boil the ocean sometimes, but you're just leveraging what you may already own. So
yeah, I mean, hey, that's the important part. Like, you may already get a lot of this stuff through your licensing. Why not take advantage of it? I mean, if you're looking for the right way to do things, I think you have to leverage. What do you have today that you could leverage versus what are the gaps and potential costs, right? If you're already paying for something, you might as well try to get the most out of it. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this conversation. But before we go, we were kind of talking before we hit the old record button here, and we started talking a little bit about video games. I got one I want to ask you to share, if you don't mind. You mentioned you had a tattoo, which I'm going to guess is the answer to my question, which is, what is your favorite classic video game? And I guess, Jim, you kind of came up with this question before you answer, Eric. Define classic. Like, what does classic mean in this context?
So what I was thinking was a video game that you went somewhere and either got in or stood in front of, maybe at like a pizza shop or something, and you put coins into it to play it. Yeah, that's what I had in mind. Some people might be like, what the heck is he talking about?
A lot of people are like, what are you talking about? They don't remember arcade machines and pumping quarters into those things.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's what I had in mind. But go ahead and answer it however you like.
All right, Eric, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it'd be classic in the sense of the series of Legend of Zelda. So, but when, the first Zelda came out, I was way too young to understand what was going on, but I watched my dad play it. But my favorite in the series would not be considered classic, at least not
Breath
yet.
of the Wild.
That, or honestly, Twilight Princess, I also really, really enjoyed. So, but each game in the series is so unique. It's hard to sort of compare them all, but
they've done a pretty good job of really kind of varying not only like the stories, but also the artistic style of the series for Legend of Zelda. I mean, most people kind of think about it of, back in the day, Link and the Master Sword and the Triforce, right? And sort of like this 2D top-down, scrolling sort of adventure type thing. And then you look at something like on Nintendo Switch, Breath of the Wild, which is like this masterpiece of an open world and intricate systems. And it's like, oh, you see that mountain in the distance? You can go there and you can climb it if you've got enough, strength or energy to get up the hill. I mean, it's amazing how far it's come. And then in between, then you've had things that have been more stylistically like cartoon versus more like a video game and like cell-based shading and things like that.
With Wind Waker, I'd say honestly, I'm a Nintendo fanboy, but there's always been the knock on them that everything's underpowered. So, sometimes it seemed like they did that because that's the only way they could make the game function. But,
well, it's smart though. I mean, for whatever reason, it still looks great by any standards. I mean, is it full motion video and, sort of cutting edge reflections and ray trace graphics, right, and all this other stuff. No, but it looks really good, and as if it performs really well, right? That's probably the most important thing. All right, so you got what was your choice again, Eric? Which Zelda?
I'll go with Twilight Princess.
Twilight Princess. All right, Jim, what's your favorite old man video game? Stand up.
Old man video game. Well, it's actually one I played in a pizza parlor, but it was sit down. So it was a card game called Spy Hunter.
Spy Hunter.
Someone brought it up on one of our project calls the other day, and he's like, "Oh, like reminds me of Spy Hunter." I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I love that game." Mm-hmm. You could do like the oil slick, you could do the big cloud of smoke, and then you had to dock yourself into
the semi.
The semi, yeah. I mean, for my money, that game was. And then we had the sit down one. To me, it was like you felt like you're driving a real car. Think about that. That total 2D view, but it just, so that
plus a super classic intro sound kind of theme, that do 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 do. Like, I mean, just
I was gonna do the what you just did, but I was afraid we get a strike.
Well, I did it so poorly that no one would ever be able to recognize it in the real world, so I think we're probably okay. All right, so for myself, I guess technically it is a classic. It has been around for 18 years. World of Warcraft. I still play it to this day. I've been playing it for 18 years. I am one of those nerds that back in the day stood in line to get different expansion packs as they came out. And it is still one of my main drugs of choice when it comes to hitting the video game. And it's expansion week. Dragon Niles just came out, so of course I've got to check that out when I get time. I don't have as much time as I used to, so not necessarily into the whole raiding thing. My wife and I used to be in a raiding guild, so we were a World of Warcraft house, for a while there. But
what was
18 years for one video game is pretty darn good.
What was that one video that was on YouTube and they were on a raid and like the one guy just like goes
more
off?
Dots.
What's it?
More dots. Yeah, there's a couple famous Warcraft clips. There's one with they're going into a raid against a dragon called Onyxia, and basically the encounter is you've got 50 people on your side, and then this dragon who spawns a bunch of little dragon whelps, and the idea is they tend to overwhelm your group, and you end up dying when Onyxia takes her deep breath and sort of wipes out the raid. And you have this classic raid leader, kind of yelling out more dots, damage over time, which basically means more damage, onto the different things and handling the whelps and, ad control, stuff like that. So now I'm nerding out about World of Warcraft. And the other one is Leroy Jenkins.
Leroy Jenkins. This is what I was trying to think of. Yeah.
He charges into a room and they're like preparing for like this thing. And I read that this was more like a stage thing. It's not actually something that actually happened, like just off the cuff. But they're like trying to figure out how to tackle this room, and the character of Leroy Jenkins he comes up on comms on voice chat, and he's like, he just yells his name, Leroy Jenkins, and he just runs right into the room.
He ruins their whole plan.
And ruins the whole plan and just kind of kills himself. And he's become a very popular cultural icon in the game, and it's also stretched outside of the game. So when you hear someone say Leroy Jenkins, they're basically just charging into battle without any thought.
Yeah, and ruining everybody else's well laid out plan. Anyway, you have to go into YouTube and search Leroy Jenkins if you don't know what we're talking about. Watch this video. It's hilarious.
Yeah,
even if you don't play video games.
All right, before I start nerding out even more about it, we'll go ahead and wrap up for this week. Eric, thank you so much for being part of this. We'll have links to yourself on LinkedIn for people to kind of connect and reach out if they've got questions. I know you also had a blog, Eric and Identity, ericandidentity.com. I guess what's the 2-second sort of, what is that?
That is my Microsoft Identity nerding out. So it's mostly technical content about various Azure AD related things. So
yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there. So definitely a good read, and you have been posting content, which is great. So
I try. It's a lot of work to write.
That's why we do a podcast. So I'll have a link to that in our show notes. I'll also have a link to Semperis, SEMPERIS.com, where you can learn more about what Eric and the fine folks over there are working on, as well as a link to Microsoft Entra if you want to read the company line on kind of what that is all about from the Microsoft perspective, as well as links to Jim and I on LinkedIn. Definitely looking for feedback on what you liked about the show, topics, things you want to see us cover in the future, things like that. Definitely hit us up on LinkedIn and be happy to take that under advisement. And I think that's going to be it for this week. You can find us on the web, identityatthecenter.com. We're on Twitter so far, the dumpster fire that has turned into, at IDAC Podcast. And with that, I'll go ahead and leave it. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.